Again, we are excited to have you join us for the North Carolina Conference for Educational Equity, brought to you by the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation at NC State. So again, welcome Dr. Shefty Snipes and Dr. Damian Lewis for their session, Equitable Learning Experiences, Moving Beyond the Situation. And I'm here to support you as your session's presenter. I'll be dropping things in the chat. I'll be monitoring questions that you may have, as well as linking any content from the session slides that may be shared with you while we're learning together today. And at this time, I'd like you to introduce you to your session presenters. Welcome and thank you so much. I'm going to turn over the mic to you.
All right, well, good evening. My name, again, is Dr. Damian Lewis. I do work for Wake County Public Schools as a senior administrator for professional learning. It is my pleasure to be here with you all today as we present equitable learning experiences, moving beyond a situation. I'll now pass the mic over to my beautiful colleague, Dr. Snipes.
My name is Dr. Sheftina Snipes, and I am an academic facilitator with the West Mecklenburg High School, with the Charlotte Mecklenburg School Systems, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for being in attendance.
So just one note, as we go through the session today, there will be a few opportunities for some interaction and engagement. So we'll ask that if you'd like, it's completely optional, have a mobile device or a second device handy. It'll just make doing some of the activities a little easier, but again, that is not required. But if you do want to have that handy for a couple of activities, I'll close the window in about 20 seconds to give you time to grab that device. All right, that window of opportunity is closing. Again, if you want to grab that device, go ahead and get started. So as we consider what we will be discussing today, how do we move beyond the situation? Let's start here by having the opportunity we want to introduce you to and have you meet Jesus. So just some things about Jesus. Jesus was born here in the United States. His parents came here as children and largely grew up with very little or no knowledge really that they were illegal immigrants, that they were considered legal. Time passed, they were able to find stable work, built a career, stable life for their family with 3 children. Now, when Jesus entered high school, unfortunately, his father died. Not long after that, in January 2019, his mother was deported, leaving Jesus, then 17 years old, in his family home, and now in charge of raising 2 middle school siblings. So as we were talking about earlier, what's the situation here? For Jesus, the situation is his father is now deceased, his mother's been deported, Jesus is a high school student. Jesus is a father figure for
Layla, can you go to the garage and see what Carter's doing?
He comes to school just enough now to stay on schedule because of the security it provides under DACA protection. So as we continue today, we'll discuss more about how situations like these don't have to be the end all be all in our ability to support individuals. As Freire defines here, situationality, in a sense, consider it as the reflection about the very condition of the human existence. Critical thinking by means by which people discover each other to be in a situation. What's our point here? Our current educational structure does not formally support or provide supports for students like Jose's or those in similar situations. Unfortunately, equity is questionable. As we continue today, we will discuss how situations like these, how they create barriers and how we have to work towards finding personal solutions to find some form of resolution for those students that we serve. Again, we'll use this term throughout. Freire references situationality, which also might be referenced when we say, have you been in a situation? For our goals, we're going to briefly explore the situationality model. You reflect on your own personal situations, juxtapose those with others, those whose situations may be similar to yours, as well as those whose situations do not look anything like those that you've experienced. And then we'll begin the initial conversation to move beyond personal presumptions, in a sense, moving beyond those roadblocks that we sometimes think keep us from finding solutions. So we're doing a lot about talking about situations. And we had heard one probably a few minutes ago, a situation that was going on. So what I'm going to ask that you do with your device, perhaps, if you will log into menti.com, if you're using a mobile device, you can use that code to get there more quickly. A link will be dropped for you in the chat. But what we're going to ask that you do is choose an image that best expresses your perception of your current situation, whether it's image 1, 2, or 3. And I'm going to flip over to the computer. So if you'll join us on menti.com, and we'll give you a moment or two to go ahead and chime in with those responses, and we'll just kind of get a test for where we feel like participants are today in their given situations. Take another 20 seconds to let a few more people chime in. This will remain open, so we'll be able to see. But as you can see here, where some energy is flowing, and I think we might all understand right now, considering all the things that are going on in our personal lives with the world, in our professional lives in regard to education, image C seems to be resonating most people's situation. And maybe right now you're throwing your hands up in one big old ball of confusion where that we've seemed to found ourselves in. Some of you all might be like image B, where you just want to rage and scream against the proverbial machine as to what we're experiencing right now. And for those of you who are with image A, the kind of situation professed by the bliss of opening your arms and looking up to the sun in excitement, I envy you right now, because that is not where I am. But as we continue, we want to consider what situation might you be in. As again, your image that you selected might have been, but people in A or B, you either have to work with or support, and how it sometimes creates barriers between finding those solutions to support one another. You don't understand why they are where they are. So how did we? Let's go back to the presentation. Let's recap a brief exploration of our history of education in America, just touching on a few points. So we know that the school was focused on areas to include religion, family, morality, but in short, you know, academic instruction nor equal opportunity, that's not important. Evidence further by other disparities, such as education opportunities were limited for women, for girls. And in a sense, we know that those inequities persisted for those individuals of color. We know eventually there were shifts in the educational model that led more to what we are familiar with today, with a heavy emphasis on success and promotion of core skills to prepare learners for life and future careers. Be that as it may, even with those changes, we know that there were instances where there have been some critical shifts in the field of education. When thinking about landmark issues such as Brown versus the Board of Education and the decision that led to the transformation of our schools, thinking about more recently with Race to the Top, again, transformations within our schools. We still want to say that the goal has always been to improve, transform, provide better experiences for all learners. Unfortunately, though, that has not always been an achievable goal. Even now in our country and throughout the world, we see that there's still so much work to be done. Inequities persist, especially in consideration of performance rates, graduation, and other elements that when we start thinking about education in America, that continue to contribute to the widening opportunity gap. What has remained constant is that we as educators, We are continually in high demand, but we are outnumbered, overworked, and sometimes confused as to how we can solve all the issues and problems that we are bombarded with. But what also remains clear is just to remain to focus on reaching and connecting to our students. We know that that's what we have to do in order to help them reach those outcomes. Hence today, we want to begin that conversation on how to move beyond the difficulties of the opportunity gap that are continually exacerbated by various inequities. How do we combat that by considering situations?
But first, we need to define equity. And we need to look at how does situationality become a point of inequity. As you can see, currently there is no working definition for educational equity. So let's just look at the word equity. How do we define equity? Webster's dictionary defines equity as justice according to natural law or right, freedom from bias or favoritism, just being equitable. It also defines it as the money value of a property, the common stock of a corporation, a risk, interest, or ownership right in property, a right, a claim in equity. We're talking about English chancery and comprising a settled and formal body of legal and procedural rules or doctrines, trial or remediation justice under or by the rules and doctrines of equity, or a body of legal doctrines and rules developed to enlarge, supplement, or override a narrow, rigid system of law. So as you can see, there are multiple definitions of equity. Unfortunately, we're experiencing difficulty acknowledging a universal definition of equity as it specifically applies to our educational system. We each determine what we mean when we say educational equity and how it applies to each of our individual school systems. We're going to take a moment and we're going to look at an article. And the article is entitled, Why Understanding Equity versus Equality in Schools Can Help You Create an Inclusive Classroom. You're going to have an opportunity to skim through the article, and we're going to choose a few words or phrases that summarizes your thoughts about equity as you're reading. The article can be found at bit.ly, bit.ly //20 equity. And then you're going to post your word or your phrase in Menti at www.menti.com, and the code is 655613. Now, you're going to have 8 minutes to read the article, choose a word or phrase that summarizes your thoughts about equity, and we're going to actually put the Menti up so that we can capture your thoughts about equity. In this time frame, we will put the link to the article and the link to Menti into the group chat so that you will have access to both.
Really? Me basa.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. As you can see, several of you touched on the things that we're going to talk about in just a moment. The importance of being inclusive, the importance of being fair, being adaptable, utilizing our resources properly, and the importance of the individualized situation of our students. Because when we're talking about equity, that's essentially what we're speaking of. Being adaptable and being inclusive and being fair. When we go back to education, and we're looking at Freire believed that education and politics are intertwined. One of his main tenets of his critical pedagogy proclaimed that teachers and students had an obligation to be made aware of politics and how it surrounds education in order to reduce their level of oppression. When we're looking at educational equity, in order for us to ensure educational equity, two things have to exist. First, fairness. Second, inclusion. When we're speaking of fairness, we're talking about ensuring that the personal and social circumstances do not prevent students from achieving their academic potential. If we're looking at inclusion, we're looking at the means by setting a basic and minimal standard for education that is shared by all students, regardless of their background, their personal characteristics, or their location. So in other words, by sheer definition of fairness, you must be able to see and acknowledge the personal, social circumstances of your students. Furthermore, you cannot commit to inclusion if there's no acknowledgement of fairness. This loops us back to situationality. In a sense, how we govern ourselves in various circumstances and our limited ability to connect with one another when their circumstances do not align with ours, talks about our situation, our situationality. Hence, when we explore individual situations, in order to gain an insight into our students' deep culture, we have to take into consideration their specific circumstances, their personal surroundings. and how they interact based upon those personal surroundings. So let's take a look at Leah.
I think that my ADHD and depression, anxiety are all definitely directly related to my childhood. I moved to Ohio when I was 8 years old because my father had passed away. He had cancer, and how my mom took it afterwards. Started to have a really bad drinking problem and started taking prescription medications all the time. As a kid, I was always afraid something was gonna happen. I've always been anxious. I mean, the depression didn't seem to start until I was like in my teens.
Like her sophomore year, you definitely hit a crisis point there where we came close to hospitalizing her for suicidal ideation.
So based on the definitions that were just shared with you, and also the notations provided by Freire, you just had a chance to explore and think about Leah and what situation she was in. Now, when we think of Leah and other students like her, what do we normally do? How do we normally combat situations like that? Well, if we want to be blunt, we think that normally we consider how money can help. We throw money at the issue. We try to say, oh, it's going to be some great resource we can purchase. There's this great program that we can offer. But we got to realize that those things only go so far. You know, we may even go a little bit further, and we might start making a decision about what's the demographic makeup of others like Leah, and then we associate more funding based on those parameters, not considering what their real situation might be or what situations they may encounter. We know that there's this issue, we provide resources and funding, everybody should be happy. But we know that's not the case.
Even more so, what we have found in our research is two things. First, our current educational system is more likely to invest in poverty-stricken youth than children of color. They assume that both are the same, that all children of color are poverty-stricken, but we're talking about two individual situations. Also, our system does not even address specific situations that mark our youth. So if the system does not provide, if the system does not look at the individual needs of students, we are then forced to have these critical conversations that impact our youth. So let's look at the elephant in the room. Evidence shows us that the makeup of educators juxtaposed to students is lopsided. What might that actually mean? Teach for America recently noted how students benefit from instruction from instructors who look like them. But it goes beyond that. We're talking about presumption here. The presumption here is that the individual has some idea, the person in the classroom, if you relate to your students, you have some idea about their ability to understand the individual situations of your students. We're gonna do a test. We wanna see who's in the room. I want you to go to www.bitly.com and you're going to use code number 323371. We just want to take a glimpse at who is actually here in the room with us today. And we're going to look at how that impacts our students. There are 3 questions here, so if you answer the first question, please go to the next question.
We'll give you a few moments to continue chiming in, then we'll advance to the next question.
Want to head to the next question?
Given my technical difficulties.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move back to the presentation. As you can see from the information that from our Mentimeter, 87% of the people in this room are females, 13% are males, approximately. Approximately 150% of the people that are in the room are Caucasian, and 60%, or approximately 67% are African American, and the remainder would be other. When we're looking at age, I think it just now popped up.
Mm-hmm. It did.
Let me see, I'll give you a couple of minutes. Our age doesn't seem to pull up, Damon. We can go back right now to the presentation.
Okay.
As you can see, 87% of the individuals in our room are female and 13% are male. Goldman Research Group conducted a study in 2018, and they did a sample of 1,000 full-time school teachers, and this is what they found. In the public school system, 25% of our teachers are male and 75% are female, which is very much like what we have going on in this room. The majority of the people in the room are actually female. When it comes to age, unfortunately, we don't have data to base it about who's in the room, but when we're looking at education, people who are 30 and under represent 18% of the teachers in our buildings. 57% are between the ages of 30 and 49, and 25% are above 50. So imagine if you're a student or you're teaching and you're above 50, you may not necessarily understand the individual situations of students that are in your room. When we're looking at race and ethnicity, we had about 150 Caucasians, 67 African American, and then the rest were considered non-white. The statistics on this from the study was that 79% of educators are Caucasian and 21% are non-white. So when we're looking at our students here in North Carolina, even in North Carolina, our students of color are more likely to have a teacher that does not share their racial background. Now, I understand that that's not necessarily possible, but we're looking at presumption here, right? And our presumption is continued that our teachers that encounter our students cannot relate to them because they don't share unique situations that they share. A study, the same study we talked about earlier with Teach for America said that students who actually experience at least one African American teacher by by third grade are 13% more likely to actually attend college. So the impact of actual ratio of student to teacher as far as their ethnicity actually does impact our students. So this makes us look at how we define equity, because if we are majority Caucasian and we're teaching African American students, we have to now redefine what equity means. And then we'll look at how we can begin to actually move beyond those situations.
So a friend of mine had talked about just equity in general being the existence of difference. But another friend of mine said that when we're providing equity, we're giving kids the ability to live life on their own terms. Which is to say, we've provided the educational opportunities where they can decide what they want to do, rather than having their decisions foreclosed for lack of knowledge. And so when I think of equity, I think of fit. What fits the people that are in my room, and what can give them the ability to live life on their own terms when they leave me. So I don't want to be the system and the dispenser of knowledge myself. How can I create the conditions for inquiry to occur, to develop the skills they're going to need to be independent from me, so that they can then practice that stuff on their own? I'd rather not be like a superstar to them. I'd rather be a Sherpa. You know, I'd rather be the guy that's guiding them through. And then they start to understand, you know what, I can do this. Because you can only know what you can do when you do it independently. Yeah. And so how are we setting up our systems, you know, for all of our vulnerable children so they can live life on their own terms? I think that's equity in the best way that I understand it now.
So as we consider here, we wanted to share this quote for you, and I'll read it here. It says, so the question is not, do you love all children? The question is, will you fight for justice for Black and brown children? And how will you fight? I argue that you must fight with creativity, imagination, urgency, boldness, ingenuity, and rebellious spirit of abolitionists to advocate for an educational system where all Black and brown children are thriving. So in a sense, the first step as to what we're talking about today is to simply know thyself and acknowledge your own situations. What is it that you really know? What experiences have you had? And how have they impacted how you see and perceive the world? How has it impacted how you see and perceive others? I would also say, most importantly, what about your situation has created barriers between you and others, even unintentionally, between you and the students that you serve? Consider how this impacts your ability to perceive inequities that may be present. Once you can begin to acknowledge those things, that's when you can begin to seek out opportunities to explore others' situations. You can begin the process of truly working towards understanding what Freire discusses when he says situationality, and working towards ensuring true equity. And so in a sense, our time is closing here for our session. We wanted to leave you with a quote as we wanted to take early steps towards what are the first things that you want to do to start moving towards understanding a situation. So we want to give you this call to action. Looking at the quote, fortunately for serious minds, a bias recognized is a bias. You have to name that thing, call it out in order to sterilize it. If you can't do that, you can't begin to move to action. You can't begin to make those first steps. So again, consider your own personal situations. Where are you right now? Where are you in your life? What have you experienced? But also, what areas are you in regard to the situations that you have knowledge of? And then when you're confronted by instances of inequity, move beyond the presumption of helplessness. You're not helpless just because you lack knowledge of the situation. You have to consider that just because you don't have knowledge of the situation that you are helpless. It just means that you might need help, or you have to take those steps towards doing what you can do to address the inequity. Acknowledge what you don't know, seek to gain clarity and understanding so that you can provide support. I'm going to open this space now for time. Dr. Snipes, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I think that it's very important that we continue this conversation. We've just literally touched on the tip of the iceberg. And this is a conversation that actually needs to go back into our schools, because it's very important that we look at our students as individuals and we assess their individual situations, because what may work for me may not work for another child. And we won't know that until we have these conversations. We won't be able to help our children until we start looking at our own situation, knowing where we came from and how we got to where we are. And then once we do that, we'll be able to truly establish an equitable learning environment for our students.
All right, I am seeing a few questions in the chat. First of all, there was a lot of requests for links to the 2 videos that you shared in your slide deck. If that's something that you can drop into the chat or share your slide deck, that was a request. Also, a question about the data statistics for teachers before 3rd grade and college enrollment. I think it was a slide early on of where that came from.
You said which slide was it that you were asking about?
I believe it was early on. African American teachers was it said Black teachers before 3rd grade and college enrollment, and some statistics along those lines.
I put it in the chat.
Thank you so much. So if you're in the chat, you can scroll up and down in the chat if you feel like you've missed a link to something important. So Dr. Snipes has added that link from Teach for America with those statistics. We also have a question from T. Wiseborn. As more education moves to a remote environment, how will we practice equity and inclusivity for staff? Any recommendations there?
Well, I think that first of all, we have to address the issue of the fact that less and less people are wanting to become educators. And so we have to first and foremost address that issue, because as educators, it's almost like it's a dying field. We have to we have to draw people in to want to educate our youth. And then once we draw people in, we have to target certain populations, because it's very important that our students see themselves in their educators. And that doesn't necessarily mean that a white teacher can't teach an African-American student. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that when we are looking at truly educating our youth, it's important that that dynamic shifts and that everyone that's in the building is properly represented. And the only way to do that is to, one, go back to making educators a profession that people want to be a part of. And then secondly, we all say that we do this for the passion. I know I say that I do it because it's my calling, but educators need to be paid properly, because that will draw in more people into our field. And then once we do that, then yes, we need to address who's in the room and make sure that not only ethnicity, not only race, but also gender. It's important that we have males that want to come into this field, and they can't do that because males typically are the breadwinners. And so if our schools are not paying our teachers, it's very difficult to make this profession something that attracts men to it. And so those are our starting points. And again, Freire talks about politics and how you can't separate politics from education. And so now that's a whole nother conversation, because there's certain politics that are directly impacting our ability to draw teachers into our profession.
I have another question. This one's from Dr. Caroline. How do people advocate for this at the state level beyond starting a local conversation? It's a good question.
It's a good question. I think that at the state level, that is where we start, because the individuals who are in the state actually they have a seat at the table when we're talking about politics. And so a lot of times they actually have more connection and can have more conversations than the people who are at the local education level. So I think that it's important that that our teachers who are in the districts reach out to their state representatives, because our voices need to be heard. And the more that our voices are heard, the more change can actually take place.
And I would add to that as well. In a total agreement there with letting your voices be heard, but we have to also consider, even most recently in light of things that have happened in our society, we see the energy behind when people use their voice and they use those different networks, be it you're tweeting, you're posting, you're reaching out, as Dr. Snipes just said to your legislatures, but using the power of your voice. And I think that's part of what we were saying today as far as addressing a situation. Well, you first have to acknowledge it, and acknowledging it means you're using the power of your own voice to say, this is who I am, this is where I've been, this is how it provides space for me to do certain things, this is how it limits things that I'm able to do right now. So you have to use those channels that we have so that we become this collective voice, so that we're not the only people just saying it in spaces such as this.
One of the clips that I used, and Dr. Lewis and I, we were looking at, basically said the more that you see things, the more that we talk about it, the more that we put things out there and put it on the table, that's when it becomes something that is brought to life. That's when you begin to believe in it. And so we have to actually have these conversations over and over and over again. And it has to come from multiple perspectives, because that's the only way that we will actually be able to make change.
I have an additional question from Erin Berry McCrea. I think I'm saying that right. Sorry, Erin, if I didn't. What would you like to see administrators and other community members do to address these issues?
One of the things that I can tell you we're doing in our particular district is we're looking at culturally relevant teaching, which is very important. And we're looking at the cultures, the individual cultures that are in the room. I think that it's very important that educators actually address that and make sure that the texts that they're using are multicultural, to make sure that they're listening to the voices that are not there, that are not heard, because we have to bring this to the forefront. And a lot of times it becomes a point of discomfort. And I think that as educators, we have to get used to, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And the only way we can do that is to have these conversations. And when I say that, I mean teacher among teacher, students among students. We have to have the conversations, and we may have to agree to disagree, because that's what happens when you're having critical conversations, is you agree to disagree. But as long as you're having the conversations, that's when we start making steps forward.
I have a question here from Jessica, and her question is, how do we represent all ethnicities when we're told what curriculum to use? Do you have any recommendations there?
I would say when you're told what curriculum to use, I think it's that careful interplay between recognizing what room does this curriculum provide for me to supplement or add, and having the opportunity in those areas to use those as opportunities to add in other materials, other readings, other resources, things that would layer those things into your curriculum. But then also really having conversations with your students sometimes. I was a former high school teacher, and one of the things that I learned early on was I taught literature that I enjoyed. I taught books that were part of our curriculum, but I emphasized those that resonated with me. But then opening that up and started having conversations with my Hispanic students, like mine, helped me realize a lot of gaps for them, because they were the next largest group of participants in the classroom, which led to discovering supplemental texts that weren't a part of the curriculum, but they could be layered in there so that they could see themselves in some of the readings that we were doing in the classroom. But then also offered them the opportunity to become leaders in the classroom wherein we're reading these texts and they resonate with their experience in college. And then my other students from other backgrounds can now say, oh, I didn't know that about you. I didn't know these things in your family. So I think we have to look for those opportunities where they are, no matter how small they are, and capitalize on them.
An additional question, this one is from William. How do we promote or recruit minorities to become educators? We would love to see more minority educators in his elementary school. Any recommendations or I think that's a great question.
So I can tell you now, if you're in schools and you have contact with youth that you're mentoring, that is one way that you bring different ethnicities into education. I, for one, I've had at least 2 students that I had reach out to me, and they were interested in becoming educators, and I assisted them in moving into the field. There are education programs throughout the state of North Carolina that you can reach out to. I think that it's important that we reach out to the historically Black colleges and universities, that we reach out to community colleges, students. So all of this actually takes place in the classroom when you are actually trying to figure out what our students' passions are. So when they realize what their passions are, this is when we can actually step in and say, did you ever think about teaching? I know that's how I got into teaching. My teacher told me, did you ever think about teaching? And so for us, it's important that we just not have those conversations, but we also recognize in our students people who would be a good fit for this profession and encourage them to not see it as a point of profit, because you guys know, like I know, it's not really a point of profit right now, but a point of passion and changing lives and being there to change our society, because the changes that we need to make in society will come from the students who are in our classroom today.
I would also add for us to consider too the entire spectrum of what it is that we do in education. Right now we're in this virtual room and there are people who are teachers, administrators, some who work at the central level, some who may work at the state level. And I think when we share those things, considering that we already know that we may be fighting against the fear of, oh my God, I'm going to be a teacher and I'm not going to be poor. But thinking about, okay, what are my real opportunities here? And I think sometimes we miss out on that opportunity to share the spectrum of what you can do in the field of education that lends to what students are getting in the classroom. You may be a teacher, but that there's so many paths of progression from that point that we don't always recognize until we become teachers and we see, oh, I've done this, but I might be a better fit here, or I may be able to do that. And I think that's something that when we reach out to recruit individuals, is consider where their fit might be best, but then also help them think about career-wise. How do we make sure not only that we recruit them, but we want to retain them? Because oftentimes you see a lot of efforts around recruiting teachers of color. They come in, but they may not stay in the profession long. So it's about recruitment and entertainment. We have to figure out ways to get them into the system and keeping them.
All right, I don't have any additional questions at this time in the chat, but lots of conversation, ideas, and feedback. We want to continue to have those conversations and this sharing going on in our hashtag. Just drop that into the chat. At this time, I have dropped in our feedback survey so that you can give some feedback based on your takeaways from this particular session. On behalf of the Friday Institute, I want to thank Dr. Snipes and Dr. Lewis for being genuine, for sharing, for getting us to think about hard things that we have to think about. This session, along with many of the sessions that you're experiencing in our conference today, is recorded and will be placed on our YouTube space. So you can go back and you can get those great one-liners that you all shared. Oh my God. There was many people quoting Again, we want to thank you for that. So again, there is that survey link is in the chat. If you've missed it, feel free to scroll up. And if you want to save this chat for any reason, you can click on the three dots in your chat window and it will give you a transcript of all the things that were shared in the chat. I also believe I will add back into the chat, if you missed it, a copy of the slide deck with this information, as well as one of the YouTube videos that Dr. Snipes shared that was well received by folks according to the chat. So I've just dropped in the presentation if you want to go ahead and grab that. Dr. Snipes, this is a YouTube link that you sent early on. I'm not sure the video that I haven't opened it up yet. But then I will also add that in that session feedback survey. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out in the chat. We've got lots of people profusely thanking you. Oh, and let me. Again, here is the information chat, YouTube, feedback survey. Any final questions?
Yes, I
please feel
can't see
free to
the
add into the chat.
It's not loading.
Thank you. And any final remarks from our fantastic presenters?
I just would like to leave you all again, consider as you move forward, what are the various situations? And as we move to this first year of starting a school year in the COVID era, what are some situations that our students are facing? What are some situations that we have no knowledge of, but we're going to be forced to support them in some form or manner? Even with those of us who work more so with adults, same thing. What are the situations our peers may be facing that we need to be knowledgeable that we either know or don't know so that we can move towards addressing any inequities that might be impacting their work. Dr. Snipes, do you have anything?
Oh, no, you said exactly what I was actually getting ready to say. But I would like to thank you all for sharing this time with us. This has been a wonderful opportunity. I'd like to thank the Friday Institute for inviting us to be a part of the Equity Conference. And we would like to challenge you again to continue these conversations in your schools and to make sure that when you're reaching out to whether your peers or your students, even people who are above you, that you consider every moment that they may be in a different situation at this particular time, and to be very kind to them as we're moving into an unknown period of time. And so with that, I would just like to say thank you again.
I'm sorry, I got kicked off Zoom for a moment, but thank you all so much, barring me getting kicked off of Zoom again. Thank you, Dr. Snipes. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, very, very much. And thank you all for your feedback and your time today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Snipes, that data did eventually come up. You had 58% in the room who was 30 to 49.
Really?
Yep. It must have been how that question was set up. 33% was in that last.
There was a timer on that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that probably didn't show the results until after the timer was.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was the case.
Yeah.
But you guys know I was sort of kind of like, oh, this is taking a long time.
Well, as folks are kind of trickling out, again, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your amazing brains and your words. There's a lot of great comments in the chat. If you would like me to make a copy of the chat for you, I'm hoping that I have that since I got kicked out, but I can also link that to you in an email along with some other data I can share with you.
Thank you. That would be awesome. All right. Take care. I'm going to go ahead and sign off then.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.